Hello. Thanks for finding your way to me on Sway. I'm Bobby Joe, and we have an election. Time is running out, and we've hardly had a chance to inform ourselves. I've done my homework, but before we start talking about any of that, taking our last look at the two main candidates in the Canadian election, I thought it'd be fun to take a look at what things looked like 10 years ago, back where it all began. So take a trip in time back with me.
Let's start with the experience section. Nothing about balancing a budget or making a payroll.
Didn't he say budgets balance themselves?
So what are his policies?
Legalizing marijuana. Is that the biggest problem we have to solve?
He has some growing up to do.
And he says he's going to cancel income splitting for families.
Actually, those are the two that were kept. Marijuana was legalized and income splitting for families was taken home. And now for the most tragically Canadian part of the commercial.
People, being prime minister is not an entry-level job.
I'm not saying no forever, but not now.
Nice hair, though.
Justin Trudeau. He's just not ready.
I don't know how much more Canadian an opposition party's campaign commercial could be, but here we are. If you thought that was a little painful to watch in retrospect, take a look at this.
Stephen Harper says I'm not ready. I'll tell you what I'm not ready for. I'm not ready to stand by as our economy slides into recession. Not ready to watch hardworking Canadians lose jobs or fall further behind. I am ready to do what my opponents won't. Ask our wealthiest to pay more tax so our middle class can pay less. I'll lead this country with a new plan for our economy that works not just for the few, but for everyone.
I know, I was cringing too, watching the same thing. I pulled those commercials because with the election coming up, I thought it would be funny to watch. But the unexpected reaction that I had to it was, and it was a big reaction, but the actual reaction was more like, if only we knew then what we know now. And I feel like this time we do have a chance to at least know. We can have knowledge, even though we have a prime minister we don't know anything about, and we have a very short time to make a decision that impacts the country in such a huge way. Because not knowing anything about one of the candidates, I think, puts us in a very dangerous position to have low information voting happen. When I say low information voters, what I mean is people who maybe aren't interested in politics, they don't have time, maybe they don't understand. It's not an intelligence comment. It is simply some people just don't care. And they can be misled. And people who are trying to mislead will count on that. Check for yourself and make your own decisions. Don't let the politicians only tell you what it is you want. You are the voter, and this is your country. And one thing that I think is missing is we need a citizens campaign so that we can say, hey, while you're campaigning, here's what we actually want, instead of the things you're trying to currently rile us up about. Honestly, I'm looking for someone to play fair, speak the truth, allow the truth, and let me decide in the end, because I am an adult, I'm a Gen Xer adult, and I don't take very kindly to people getting in my business. And so I'll be taking a look at how much in my business either party might be or either candidate, and we'll go from there. And I think it's important to note before I get going here that I am not working for either party. I'm not affiliated with either party in any kind of formal or informal way. I voted historically for NDP, Liberal, and Conservative in my lifetime. So I have a broad range behind me, and I don't just vote because it's Conservative, or I don't just vote because it's Liberal or because it's NDP. I'm going to vote to see which makes sense for the times, and I'm going to vote for who I trust. And if I think what they're saying is true, or if they're just trying to get my vote. So what did I learn in my research adventure about the candidates? I will say at the outset that there will be probably me talking more about Mark Carney because he is the one that I didn't really know much about. Of course, we know that Pierre Poilievre has been around. The one difference that stands out between the two candidates, merely on biographical information, is the fact that one of them lived in Canada throughout and had his businesses in Canada, raised his family in Canada, went to university in Canada, and really has, lived being a Canadian in Canada. And Mark Carney, on the other hand, has had a much more international background, where he was born in the Northwest Territories, and then he was raised, I believe, in Edmonton. And after that, he went to Harvard, and I believe went to school after that, maybe in London. I'm not exactly sure. I don't have it all committed to memory, but I did try my best. So what I got out of it is Mr. Carney, as soon as he could leave, left, and he's had a fulfilling career as bank governor. All of this is going to be my opinion. That's all it ever is when somebody's talking about who they think would make the best leader. I think for me, in terms of who do I think would be able to relate to me the best out of the two candidates as a Canadian, living the Canadian experience, I would have to put that in the Pierre Poilievre category. Honestly, I'm not sure that anything turns on that, but it does have some impact for me, that if somebody is going to be leading a country, it helps if they have been in it for the long haul. So now, if we move on to the track records of both of the candidates, we'd see that neither one of them has been a prime minister for a long period of time. So we can't go on a prime ministerial track record per se. Mr. Carney's only been there for 1 month, and Pierre Poilievre has not been prime minister yet. So we can't take that as a track record. What have they done? We know that Pierre Poilievre caught the political bug early, and that when he was younger, he was competitive in sports and got some kind of a sports injury that kept him from being able to continue with sports. I believe it was wrestling. And he was bored out of his mind. He was a busy guy. So he started going to political meetings with his mother, and he caught the bug from there. And he went out to Ottawa, and he's been there since he was 25 years old. I know some shades being thrown at Mr. Poilievre for being a career politician, for whatever that means. To me, if career politician were being used as a bad thing, what comes to my mind is the type of politician who just goes, becomes a bureaucrat, essentially shows up or doesn't show up, as the case may be, collects the paycheck, and then later collects the pension, but doesn't do a lot for the Canadian public or for the government as a whole. So that's what I would call a career politician. Or I would say, being a career politician, that's what your career is. And I don't actually have a problem with it in the case of Pierre Poilievre. And here's why. He's essentially grown up there. He's spent his formative years there. He knows how things work. He knows who to ask to get something done. He knows who's going to be an impediment to this, that, and the other thing. And of course, Mark Carney can ask people that. But what I think is that, at least with Pierre Poilievre, and again, this is just for this particular point of track record, I think that I'm okay with him being there for as long as he's been. He's worked under Harper, where they had a balanced budget, so he knows what that feels like. He knows what that looked like, and he would probably have some takeaways still of what worked there and what they could do better this time, and hopefully get us back to where we need to go. That would be the hope. And so to me, him being there isn't a bad thing. One more thing about track record with Pierre Poilievre, and that is his consistency. Over the years, he has had a consistent message with very few exceptions. And as we know, being a career politician, we have lots that we can look back on to double check that. As long as I've been paying attention to Pierre Poilievre, he has been consistent with what he's been saying. How I first got to know who Pierre Poilievre was is when he acted like a voice in the darkness or a voice in the wilderness, when asking what's going on here, and asking for some answers when we really needed them and when people in Canada were afraid to talk. And that is the first time, born and raised in Canada, that I have ever felt that my freedom to express myself was being diminished. By track record, I would say Pierre Poilievre has a good one. Let's move on to Mr. Carney. I believe he went to several Ivy League schools to obtain his degrees in economics. So he's taken that to the doctorate level. He has worked as the governor of the Bank of Canada. He has also worked as the governor of Bank of England most recently before he came back to Canada during COVID in 2020. And during lockdown, that's when he wrote his book. He's been here ever since. Ostensibly, he has been the economic advisor for Justin Trudeau during basically the last 5 years. And he's been involved, of course, with international climate efforts. Again, the one with banking, I'm assuming he was good at his job there. But as we heard on the commercial earlier, and remember, if we knew then what we know now, we do know that Mr. Carney, at least Pierre Poilievre says, that informally he was his economic advisor when he got back from England. So it could have been as much as 5 years, which would be about half of the term that Justin Trudeau was in. As well, we know financially that Canada's not doing so great these days. We've got a giant debt. We've got a terrible housing crisis. Inflation is the pits. And we've got a problem with our neighbor down south. So what do we have to say about Mark Carney's record with Trudeau's Liberal government? So he might have his own answers to that, but for me, I find that compelling is that he was there and he wasn't a pro bono advisor or informal advisor to Justin Trudeau about healthcare or parks and recreation. It was about financial advising. And we know that their track record just wasn't that good. He just wasn't ready. And we get that. So is Mark Carney ready? As we heard in the commercial, it's not an entry-level job. And we're certainly not saying that Mark Carney is coming in with no experience under his belt in life. He does. And he has some international experience, a lot of international experience. I've told you what I think about that already. And whether he'd be able to relate to somebody who has lived here their whole lives and has always got to live with the consequences of the new policies that are enacted by the Canadian government. Something I find disappointing in all of that is Mark Carney's own response anytime he is asked questions about Trudeau's government, and his answer is simply, I wasn't the prime minister then. I wasn't there, but he was there. I would far rather somebody come out and say, you know what, I was there. I had the plan, but that kind of plan takes a really long time to implement. Or I had a plan, I was advising him, but he never listened to me. And here's 5 examples of when I tried to advise him and he didn't listen to me. Or he advised him and he listened to him and it just didn't work out. And that's what we should be worried about. Accountability is huge because I feel throughout the last decade, there has been so little accountability for so many scandals and so many things that were done in a sideways manner, no resolution, and it really can make the electorate feel powerless. Every time he says, I wasn't there, I had nothing to do with that, it was pro bono, there starts to be a song playing in my head.
I don't know what to do.
So it wasn't you.
All right.
Right? Say it wasn't you. I think where I settled on the whole track record thing is that I know what Pierre Poilievre's track record is as it pertains to Canadian government and Canadian politics. So I know where he stands and I know that he has experience. It certainly wouldn't be entry level for him if he were to assume the position of Prime Minister of Canada. By comparison, I think Mark Carney has 5 years, depending on who you believe, 5 or 1 year of experience in economic advising of the previous administration under the Liberals, and so 5 at most since he's been back. And he says those 4 years didn't count. So let's say 1 year of government there experience. He's been the governor of the Bank of Canada and that kind of a thing. But I actually think that in that case, Pierre Poilievre has a bit more practical experience in the actual building and in the actual country. So on track record, and he has the good and positive experience under the Stephen Harper administration as well. So I'm going to say for track record, he's got a good one. Mark Carney's track record is, it sounds great in all of the banking and the investments. I'm just not so sure how relevant and transferable those skills actually are when it comes to being the Prime Minister of Canada. If I put consistency along with track record, I think in terms of consistency, we know from the time Pierre Poilievre was a teenager when he first wrote an essay of what he would do if he were Prime Minister of Canada. And his platform remains pretty consistent, and that's pretty amazing. So in terms of him being consistent all along, I give him full points for that, because if I have to base my decision on, do I know who I'm truly going to get if I cast my vote for this candidate? Even if you don't like him, I think you can agree that you would know what you were getting if you voted for him. Consistency with respect to Mark Carney. I don't know what I'd be getting with him. If I can trust his campaign promises now, they seem to contradict the other things that he's been saying as early as 5 years ago when he wrote a book, how the country should be run and what qualities a leader should have. And so I think in terms of consistency, I would say consistently, he has a similar view to that which we have observed under the administration of Justin Trudeau. I could do a whole show based on what the book said, but I think that you would find even the show talking about the book boring. Suffice to say, he said that the carbon tax was his favorite, the best tool for achieving net zero. And he talked about why this was wonderful and all of the wonderful returns and virtuous circle. Well, I don't know if he used it in that context, but he uses that term quite often throughout the book, the virtuous circle that it's supposed to create. In terms of consistency, I think we would have to default to the idea that he has globalist tendencies and international designs. When you're reading the book, you can tell he's very married to his own idea in that, which people do. I'm married to my own ideas right now. So that's how things work. So it's my responsibility then to see what I think of that. So to finish off with consistency with Mark Carney, I just don't know. I would say that this is a person who changes his stance depending on what he needs to do to get a vote or to get a rise in popularity. As opposed to what he set out in his book, he is only too happy to copy whatever Pierre Poilievre says that he's going to do. It's almost like Pierre said he's going to axe the tax. So that's the first thing that Mark Carney did. But the ironic thing is that was his baby, from what I can tell. I mean, I don't know that for sure. It might have also simultaneously occurred to Justin Trudeau. I can be fair about that. But I can also say that he does publicly in his book, which was only published in 2021, he publicly endorses that as a tax. So we know that that's what his stance is: globalist, more government involvement in day-to-day life. He's been consistent about that. And I can talk about that a little bit more, and I will, because I think that that's probably one of the more important things that I think I've learned since looking into what I would likely get if I were to have Mr. Carney as my Prime Minister. I think when somebody shows you who they are, you believe them. If somebody tells you what they're going to do and who they are, you believe them. And if they take those words, commit them to paper, sign their name beside it, and publish it to the whole world, then I think you should believe them. And so what I'm doing for myself, and again, my opinion, I am choosing to believe the words in Mark Carney's book because it was far enough away from the election about 5 years ago that he was writing it, that it wouldn't be possible for him to simply tailor the book in order to use it as propaganda for this election with these set of facts that are going on currently right now. So if that were the case, I think he would have written some different things in his book for sure. So I think that the book is a good representation about what you could expect to get if you vote for Mark Carney. For me, I'm going to choose to believe Prime Minister Carney's words in his book. And I take those over the words that he's using right now in his campaign. When I feel like I have to choose one or the other, and they're coming from the same person, that's generally a check mark on the bad side of the ledger for me, because trust and accountability are big things. Again, I think when somebody comes out and has the courage to say, look, I screwed up. Here's why. Here's the things that happened that contributed to that. And I'm going to make sure that that doesn't happen again. And here's my plan. And that's what I would want to hear. I don't want to hear it wasn't me. That tells me I don't know what I'm going to get if you're my prime minister. So I would say Mark Carney's book is actually a gift to us, especially when looking back at those commercials 10 years ago. We really didn't know what was in the head of Justin Trudeau. We do now, and it appears to be very similar to what's in the head of Mark Carney. And just to go through the book just a little bit, I mean, the first 130 pages or so, I think 200 pages, is about economic theory, the history of value theory and how it's changed through time immemorial. It's not Mark Carney's own words. I mean, his own words are in there, but largely these pages could have been summarized, I think, in probably 4 pages, because this isn't new information. It's information from history. And for that reason, it read quite a lot like a textbook to me, a university economics textbook. And then sprinkled in there was the history of the Magna Carta and how that is involved with today's politics and the rise and fall of the gold standard. So as you can see so far, that does sound like a university textbook. And then next, the COVID crisis. And he also talks about the big economic crisis and the role that banks had to play in that and how that can protect people. And he also talks about Bitcoin and the 3 different kinds of cryptocurrencies and tells you what his favorite one is in there as well. So first of all, the premise of the book uses the words value as it's defined in terms of economics. And then he also uses the term values, which would refer to our intrinsic values, maybe like loyalty or things like health. So what his premise seems to be is that as theories of value have arisen over time and developed, our intrinsic values have eroded or have become somewhat interchangeable with actual value, like a price tag. So the long and the short of it is, if it doesn't have a price tag attached to it, then it doesn't have value. And basically talking about erosion of basic morality. What he also seems to be talking about is that this problem could be fixed by using the market itself to correct the problem, by putting political technology, private investment and public investment, and incentives and disincentives to get the right people with the right values being financed and getting the benefits in society, while the other ones are going to have to suffer some pain for a while during the transition. And from what I can tell, he didn't seem to think that the transition risks associated with the change over to green energy from our current energy sources would cause much risk to Canada. His book is all about reaching net zero. So with net zero, there comes a lot of control with the government. And that's one of the things that I think is most concerning about the Liberals that would be coming in, is how my personal freedoms are going to be treated. Throughout his book, I get the sense that he would be open to legislating morality, which I would find to be a huge infringement to personal freedom. I don't care if a person leans left, right, upside down, inside out. It's dangerous, no matter who you are, if your personal freedoms are taken away. Because once they're gone, you can never guarantee who's going to be in power next, and those same freedoms are gone And then there'll be somebody telling you what morality they would like to legislate against you. And that's what I'm afraid of. The language that I didn't like there when he's talking about legislating different values and using political technology to do that. The term political technology bothered me because it was quite vague. And so if you're using political technology, I'd like to know what kind of political technology that would be. He also makes the statement too that it's basically like a muscle, that the more we use and flex these values, that the more we'll get used to it and then we'll get better and better at it. So basically, after a while, we'll just get used to it, is my impression of it. And I could be wrong. I'm open to other opinions of it too, but that's kind of my takeaway from it, is that people aren't capable of making good decisions anymore, if they ever were, on their own. So the government needs to step in and use the market, use banking, use investments, use incentives and disincentives to manipulate the market really in favor of certain moral values, and letting the market kind of dictate your values or legislate your values. I also tend to think when people are doing well, when they're not in survival mode, that's when they have the greatest capacity to look outward and help other people. If you're trying to survive, trying to scrape money together to get food on the table, or if it's really, really hard to afford where you live or even to find a place to live, chances are you're not going to be happy when there are sanctions against you with respect to the environment when you didn't ask for it. I am for the environment. I'm for clean water, clean air. I have children. I live in this world and I breathe in this world. But I don't necessarily think that Mark Carney's plan was the one to go with, or if it was very, very premature at the time. For me, it didn't make sense to put the carbon tax in there because I think, first off, nobody's really fond of the game where the government takes your money without you being able to say no. They get to hold on to it for a while, and then they give you back your own money, and you're supposed to be thankful for that. Also, I don't think people understood how getting carbon taxed was going to help the environment. I think at its core, it was supposed to incentivize people to make other choices. But again, at the end of the day, when people are busy, they're scraping by, trying to survive. I think that they just do what they naturally do. The carbon tax kind of came across to me as punishing a child for not making their bed when there wasn't a bed to make yet. Right. So we don't have the infrastructure in place yet. And there are ways that we can improve the world. I've heard Pierre Poilievre talk about that.
We've had direct formal requests for our natural gas from Japan, Greece, Germany, France, and I'm probably missing some others. Mm-hmm. They said, the great economist Stéphane Marion out of Calgary National Bank said, if we displaced half of the electricity demand that India will have added to its grid over the next 20 years by supplying our natural gas instead of them using coal, it would reduce global emissions by 2.5 billion tons, which is 3 times the emissions of all of Canada. So in other words, by exporting our gas, which is half as emissions intensive as coal, mm-hmm. we could do far more than we could even do if we shut our entire economy down and disappeared from the earth. So why don't we address the environment with energy abundance instead of energy poverty?
Mm-hmm. So for me, I'm like, can we do that? Let's try that. It seems like we're given the choice of either making money and being financially secure or caring about the environment. And I believe 2 things can be true at the same time. And when I hear Pierre Poilievre talk about how we can still sell our natural resources, keeping us strong, keeping us free, that feels more comforting to me than talking about transition risks and keeping a lot of our hydrocarbons in the ground before we have the appropriate infrastructure and technology to replace that. And for him to not see what the response was likely to be, and again, he wasn't the prime minister when it came out, But we know that he's also a fan of the carbon tax from his own words, from his own book that he wrote rather recently. When I got his book, I knew nothing about him. So I challenged myself to say, okay, you weren't a fan of the Trudeau government, but you don't know anything about him. Let's open the book. Let's be open about it. Let's see where we get to on that. So I did that. So the book being about values, I thought that maybe he could open with something that was super valuable to him, but had no price out. Because that, I think, would have exemplified what his book was supposed to be about. Instead, the first page wasn't even in Canada. It was all about his first day as governor for the Bank of England. And it was about the opulence and the gold and the statues and the fineries, a lot of name dropping as well. I was disappointed as a first impression because I thought if the point of the book was supposed to be about values and how we can get to those in a great way that creates virtuous circles, whatever those are, then why open your book talking about opulence and the bank? If you wanted to sound like a crony, that's how you would open a book. So that was my impression. Sorry. So moving to solidarity, page 419, he says, for Canada, that means supporting people coast to coast. I think that there are people in various regions of Canada that don't feel like the Liberal government has been fair. Page 421 of his book, he said it's critical that all rules and codes and laws be seen to be treating people fairly across the board. There can't be one set of rules for elites and insiders and another set of rules for the rest. However, there are some questions about investment portfolios. And when somebody's been the architect of the banking system in Canada and abroad, there will be questions about how much power and unchecked power and advantage that person could gain by having a position as Prime Minister of Canada or head of state. I had to read pretty far to get to these pages, and I hope you appreciate it. I read Mark Carney's book, so you don't have to. 424, resilience. That is where I found myself being a little cranky. He was talking about how government hasn't done a very good job of keeping Canada secure and safe. It's left it exposed to risks, and he was talking about that with respect to the COVID situation, and that there were a lot of shortfalls and shortcomings that were discovered while the COVID crisis was going on. I'd say in the area of resilience, Mark Carney wouldn't have my confidence on that. That's where I found myself to get a little bit grouchy. He said that countries should be pursuing a more disciplined approach to building resilience so that countries can recover from shocks more quickly and they're not as vulnerable to shocks in the first place. He really does take some time in explaining all of the efforts that should be undertaken by a government to stress test and basically do your fire drills and anything that can happen, make sure that you've planned for it, and things that you don't know can happen, plan for those too. And he says that plan beats no plan. And he said a more diverse system is a healthier system in terms of economy. And he says systemic risks tend to punish mono strategies. So if we put that into the strategy that he was proposing, it's a strategy of green energy. But in terms of what's happening right now with trade tariffs and trade wars and uncertainty, it makes sense to have a diversified portfolio. And as an investor, he should know that. And I do know by Mark Carney's own words in his book that he was aware that that was a situation that existed, talked about deglobalization and our intricate partnerships with the United States, our intimate relationship and entanglements with the United States and dependencies. To great length about talking about how even when things don't feel like they're a risk, that's when they can be the most risky, and how leaders should be stress testing for risks so that they can make their country less vulnerable to shock and they can recover more quickly. But he's saying that with respect to COVID, and says that the government has been failing and leaving us to be essentially vulnerable to things like tariffs. And so with us having dependencies there, I just wonder, what was the plan there? And whether you were there 1 year or 5 years, it sounds like it was in your mind. So I don't understand how this came as a surprise at this time. Sure, we can play the devil's advocate on that one too. Can say, but Bobby, there was a trade agreement in place. Surely they should be able to rely on that. Yes, but sometimes people break trade agreements. And Donald Trump is famous for saying things out loud long before he does them. So he had been threatening them for a long time. I was reading the book. I noticed when it came to resilience, that's where I was kind of crabby, because I feel like resilience has been ignored in favor of ideology that we weren't ready for. And these are costly mistakes to make. Bringing me to the next point of sustainability, which in his book, Mr. Carney defines sustainable development as meeting the current generation's needs without compromising future generations' abilities to meet their own needs. He's speaking about it with a backdrop of climate change and reaching net zero. However, when I read that definition, the first thing, the obvious thing that pops into my mind is our enormous debt. I don't believe that the previous administration was meeting the needs of the current generation. And having a debt like that is depriving future generations of the ability to meet their own needs. So without sustainability, without resilience, we have to remember those two are so important, because without the two of those, none of the rest matters, because we can't protect ourselves from outside forces. If we can't protect ourselves, and if we don't have sovereignty, then we can't do all of these other things. We would be at the mercy of somebody else. And that's not fear mongering. It's saying if we're very, very economically dependent or interdependent, then there will be a consequence for that if situations change. And situations have changed. And then you ask yourself, was that foreseeable? Was there a plan? And are we resilient to that? And I think the answer here is we definitely weren't all that resilient. We're not just voting for Mark Carney. We're voting for that same party who's all still there. To me, it's just like changing the face, but keeping everything else the same. I'll just quickly skip into dynamism. Dynamism he spoke of as we need to be more dynamic. We need new firms, new innovations, that we're not very resilient to shocks, and we've been harmed. Talks about new firms, new ideas taking over the old. I don't have a problem with that. I just have to see the ideas before the old are replaced. And by the way, Mr. Carney says that dynamism is most efficient if it's channeled through the market system, so that you can get your social values put through the market system. And that's how the changes will happen the best. So your social values will be determined by somebody that's not you, and they will be put into the market system that will affect you. And then those will become your values, and that over time, if I'm understanding them correctly, it's like a muscle that if you use it, you'll just get used to it. And then maybe you'll forget about the fact that he's involved in every aspect of your life. I don't know. I hope we're not like that. Page 445, social cohesion is the new competitiveness. If you read that back, that means fitting in socially has value. And I think if you've ever watched the Black Mirror episode where there is a social credit score that people are walking around with, and it would determine whether you're invited places, whether you get jobs, what kind of service you get at restaurants, all of that kind of stuff, and who would date you, that kind of thing, because value was given to values. That's something that a person could be concerned about. I see it as a theme that pops up all too often, and so I'm kind of alive to that. And if you want to know how Mr. Carney feels about sovereignty, he starts talking about it at page 454 in his book, and he said that it's actually in the context of a trade war, saying that often we think you cede sovereignty in order to join larger markets, or you take it back in times of trade wars. And he said that is such, I'm going to quote him here, because he said, true patriotism is the opposite of such egotistical nationalism. But I am noticing just a wee little bit of some nationalism. He even goes on to say history shows us how easy it is to turn nationalism into something dangerous. So you can see that right at page 455, if you go and look. So he acknowledges how easy it is to use the concept of nationalism to forward your own ideals. I keep finding examples of hypocrisy, and they keep adding up. Another place where he was talking about sovereignty, Mr. Carney says that it is all too easy to confuse independence with sovereignty. So to me, it sounds like he could be slippery with that definition. I don't know that for a fact, but it sounds like he's saying, okay, well, we can still be sovereign without being independent. We can still have interdependence, is what I'm guessing what he's saying. He said, and I think he's quoting somebody here, but he says, true sovereignty is not making laws, but the ability to control outcomes and respond to the future needs of the people. And so in that respect, I think if we are left without a strong economic plan and a way to get out of the debt, then we're going to lose the ability to control outcomes and to meet the needs of our people. So we need to be really, really careful of ceding sovereignty or ceding independence. We have to be careful of how that looks, particularly with some of the comments that have been flying around down south, if you know what I mean. I don't see humility there either. I mean, there would be humility in removing a carbon tax that you were attached to. However, what it's coming across as right now, because it's in a campaign, is hypocrisy. I don't believe, and again, it's my opinion, I don't believe that the carbon tax would be removed if it wasn't a campaign. Humility would be admitting that you were advising during the Trudeau administration and that you got some things wrong, but here's how you're going to get them right. I would trust that. All right, I've taken the opportunity to look at what Mark Carney said in his own words. I don't think they stack up with the reality of Canada. I think the timing of a lot of his plans are premature, and that he has lacked the foresight to know that and to know how that would be received by the greater Canadian public. So that doesn't give me a lot of confidence. I also don't see a lot of consistency between the campaign and between the book. So that's not doing a lot for my trust on that end. In terms of what's important to me, I would ask which candidate makes me feel most secure. And when I think of secure, is that, am I going to have the ability to continue as I am today? First and foremost, is my life going to change? Secondly, am I going to be able to afford all of the same things, the standard of living? That's security as well. But there's also another part of security, and that is with policing, and it also has to do with border security. It has to do with Arctic sovereignty and security there. So as far as those things go, I heard those things coming out of Pierre Poilievre's mouth first, and I believe I heard them coming out of Mark Carney's mouth second. I seem to notice a little bit of that a lot of what we've been hearing Pierre Poilievre say over the last year, 2 years, 3 years, is now starting to become part of the platform of the Liberals. I think if it's too much change, then the easiest thing must be true. And that is that he is likely to be quite a lot like Justin Trudeau. His plan is written out in his book. It's available for everybody to read, and I think every Canadian probably should read it. I don't think every Canadian would want to read it. I think I would just try to get it at the library and read the last couple chapters to get an idea of that, or read the whole thing if you have some time. It took me a long time. I had to offer myself some rewards along the way because it was pretty long. It's like over 500 pages, and as I said, it read like a textbook. So I think these are a couple of questions just to ask yourself. Which candidate makes you feel the most secure? Which one are you fairly assured that when you vote for them, what they're going to do if they get into power. And security comes from being independent too, and protecting our sovereignty. We'll never feel strong if we're encumbered with debt. So we need to take care of our economy. And when we're thriving, I think then we're one of the greatest countries on earth for helping out. Who would be the least intrusive in my life? Who supports freedom of expression and who likes to play fast and loose with it? Does the candidate have foresight? When they put in policies, do they take into consideration how the Canadian public is likely to act? It's an important one. Otherwise, your policies aren't going to stick. It will be a dividing variable, and it will ultimately be a big waste of time and money. Foresight is very important. Planning is very important. Who is going to keep us the most resilient? Which candidate has the most potential for unchecked power? To this, I would add, I do have some concerns about Mark Carney there, because he is a multimillionaire, architect of the Canadian banking system, also architect internationally. He has knowledge about what can benefit him. I haven't seen it translate through into the economy of Canada yet, and that's what's concerning. And also with the repetitive theme of overreach and imposing himself into almost every aspect of people's lives, going forward under the umbrella of net zero, then I think that there is potential for a lot of power that is unchecked. Here's Mr. Poilievre in his own words talking about his thoughts on freedom.
People make their own decisions, and whether it's about their love lives or about their wallets or their speech or what food they eat or car they drive, I don't want to be involved in any of those things. I'm not in this to run your life. I want to run a government. They want the government to control everything. I want pretty much the opposite. Like if I were starting a political party from scratch, I would call it the Mind Your Own Damn Business Party.
Also, I, on behalf of all Canadians, want to thank you for your immense courage and the personal political and non-political price that you have paid for standing up for your convictions and defending freedom of speech.
Okay, I'm going to take 1 minute to talk about the Donald and how I don't think Pierre Poilievre is anything like Donald Trump. I don't believe Canadian conservatives are the same as American conservatives, first of all. And I think that one thing that defines Donald Trump and why people don't like him is because he sounds mean. He's on the conservative or right side of the political spectrum. And I think that's really where there's no personal similarities that I've seen. For instance, Pierre Poilievre didn't grow up wealthy. Donald Trump grew up wealthy. He was a businessman for most of his career and somewhat of a celebrity. And Pierre Poilievre has been a politician since he was 25 years old and working in Ottawa, living in Canada. As far as I know, Pierre Poilievre's only had his one wife and children with that wife. That's not a judgment. That's just a difference because Donald Trump has more children, more wives. Pierre Poilievre is not the one who's responsible for tariffs. His hair looks nothing like him. I mean, I think they're both tall. I haven't heard Pierre Poilievre calling out other countries saying that he'd like to make them into Canada's fourth territory after none of it. My hot take on it, if I wanted to be nice, I would say he's just not ready yet, speaking of Carney, and that we should take our lessons from the past and bring them into the present and listen to somebody and what he's been saying for the last 20 years. You can trust that, I think. And I trust the policies. I trust that he's worked under an administration that has been successful before. So for all the reasons before, I would say that that's probably a good choice, or at least a choice that you could probably predict more. Not predict more. I think that the other side's just as predictable, but for different reasons. So as bored as I am of political slogans, I do think if you're looking for things to change in Canada, it's probably going to be Pierre Poilievre. I think that you get the picture about what each one stands for. One's more geared for freedom, one's more geared towards resource development, while not excluding the idea of protecting the environment. And the other side, I feel, is going to be too involved in my life, is going to be fettering my authority and agency as an adult, I feel. And I like the feeling of living in this beautiful free country the way it is. It also, frankly, scares me, the idea of putting in social values into the market system where people's livelihoods are controlled by a government who's choosing what morals and what values to implement into the marketing system. So that's concerning. I think that people are generally quite good at managing their morality, and their values, I believe, become stronger when they aren't rushing around and trying to survive. I don't trust the government that much. I would like to develop my own values. And I also think that when people are following values, not because they want to, but because they're told to, are they really values at all? So I guess I would end by saying, make sure you vote. That is our responsibility. We've talked a lot about what the responsibility is going to be of one of these two men. So we'll know soon enough. And hopefully we don't have to talk about politics for a really long time after that. And hopefully Canada will be a prosperous nation, whatever the outcome of the election. I likely agree with Polyev that if you're looking for change to happen, it's probably going to be with his party. And if you're comfortable with things continuing the same as they had been, it sounds like Mark Carney is more for you. And if you're worried about your personal freedoms, then I think that would be a vote for Polyev. If you're okay with government taking a more fatherly or parental role with you, then that would go over to Mark Carney's side. At the end of all that, my hot take would be, if you want this circus to continue, probably best to have a Carney. I'm Bobby Joe. Talk to you soon.